Hey, Westlakers, this is the second of a series of little videos that we are doing, just summarising what we were thinking about on Sunday night in terms of wise sex. The first one, if you haven't seen it, we looked at why the church has largely been silent about sex and why that really isn't an option for us anymore. In today's little video, what I'd like to do is to look at the verse that's the kind of foundation for everything that the Bible says about sex. So it's really vital that we understand the implications of this verse. So I'm going to give you a minute or so just to read that verse and have a little reflection on it, and then we're going to think about its implications for us. Okay, welcome back. So the verse there that I was referring to is Genesis 2:24. For this reason a man shall leave his father and his mother and be joined to his wife, and they shall become, and here's the significant phrase for us, they shall become as one flesh. Now what I want to point out about this verse is something that seems patently obvious, but is very significant. And that's the fact that it comes in chapter 2 and not after chapter 3. Now here's what I mean by that. Chapter 3 is where sin enters into the human story. Chapters 1 and 2 are about creation. And there's a consistent theme there through the creation, that as God creates things, he says that they're good. And particularly when it comes to humanity, he says they are very good. And so this verse about becoming one flesh, about knowing a man and wife, knowing each other, a reference again to marriage and at a more deep level to sex, it appears before sin enters the world. Now, do you see the implications for that? Sex has always been God's intention for humanity. It belongs to the good side of the equation. And that's got a couple of implications. If sex belongs to God's original intention for creation, it's good. It's not dirty. It's not embarrassing. It is something that God intended for our good, to be a blessing in us. And there's just one myth that we really need to clear up. This whole idea that gets perpetuated, that somehow the original sin of Adam and Eve, the primeval, if you like, sin, was connected to sex in some way. You'll see these things with the apple, with the bite out of it, somehow insinuating that sin had to do with sex originally. Absolute and utter nonsense. Sex belongs to creation, the good part of creation. Now, sex and sexuality certainly gets affected by sin and can be abused and used in wrong and damaging and hurtful ways. We all know that. But in and of itself, sex is good. A good thing for humanity. So let's move on. We could say that there's been two extremes in the world when it comes to the purpose of sex. Over here in this extreme, we're going to call that procreation. The idea that sex is simply for the creation of the next generation, for generating babies, if you like. And we thought in the last video how that idea of sex being antithetical to holiness and being essentially sinful kind of infected Christianity. And because of that, at points the church has taught that sex really should be confined to procreation, for a man and wife, for making children. But it's not just Christianity that has thought that way. A very recent book has pointed out that Gandhi slept next to naked women. Now, that seems a little bit odd to us, but what he was trying to prove was that he'd come to a place in Hinduism, a kind of place of holiness, if you like, in Hinduism, where he was no longer tempted by sex. And we find those kind of ideas in Buddhism as well. I don't know about Islam, to be honest. So you've got that idea over there. Over here is the idea that's probably most prevalent and popular in Western society. And this is the idea that sex is purely about pleasure. The only bounds that we put on sex today is that it's consensual and that it makes us happy. And so if you watch Hollywood films, if you watch soap operas, if you read popular novels, sex almost always is about pleasure. Now, this is an interesting thing when we think about it, because if you make sex ultimately simply about pleasure, you dehumanize the other person. So if sex really is simply about pleasure, then to be crude, in a sense, men are simply masturbating inside women. All it is about their pleasure. And if you take that to its logical conclusion, human beings aren't even necessary. And in fact, we're seeing that idea now. If you read some newspapers and look online, you'll see the idea being advocated that very soon we're going to be thinking about sex with robots. And so provided they look like human and they act like human, we don't need them to be human, providing they bring sexual pleasure to us. So they are the two extremes. Procreation, it's simply about making babies. Pleasure, it's all about my pleasure. And of course that's a scale. People fit onto that scale, and communities and religions fit onto that scale. But what I'm going to suggest to you over the next couple of days is that there is an alternative to those ideas. And in that verse that we're thinking about from Genesis, that's really foundational to our thinking about sex and sexuality, God's word says that the ultimate purpose for sex is oneness. That through the act of sex, a man and a woman become so intimate and so close that they become one. Now, it's talking more than just the physical here. We're emotional beings, we're relational beings, we're spiritual beings, and what it's saying is that the act of sex brings us together relationally and emotionally with the other person, so that we become not just physically one, but increasingly one emotionally and relationally. There's an idea that might help us here. Apparently in Dutch, one of the slang words for sex is sewing. Now, if you think about it, what happens when you sew something? You put two pieces of cloth together, and then the needle and the thread transfer through them in a physical act, binds them together. And when that physical act is over, the two pieces of cloth, because of that physical act, remain sewn together, bound together. And that's really what God's word is saying here about sex, that it binds us together, it sews us together as men and women in the context of marriage, so that we can increasingly experience a oneness of physicality, of relationality, of emotions as well, and grow deeper with that person and in that relationship. And of course, you don't need me to tell you that that is a widely different view of the purpose of sex than that we normally get. So laying that foundation, that the idea that sex is for the deepest experience of intimacy and knowledge between two human beings, we're going to be thinking over the next couple of days specifically at the book of Proverbs and Proverbs chapter 5, and thinking about God's wisdom for sex and how we work out that purpose in our marriage lives. Thanks for taking the time again